Hello there, and welcome back. Maybe you've had a long day, or maybe you're simply curious about one of humanity's greatest adventures. Either way, tonight's journey takes us to the roof of the world, to a story of camps carved from ice and rock, of ropes stretched across crevasses deeper than cathedrals, and of two men who would become legends on a mountain that had claimed so many before them. You don't need to do anything now but settle in. Let your thoughts drift toward the Himalayas, toward 1953, toward a mountain that had turned back every attempt to stand upon its summit. Tonight, we're exploring how Edmund Hillary and Tenzing Norgay, along with a team of climbers, Sherpas, and porters, established a chain of camps up the flanks of Mount Everest, each one a fragile outpost in the death zone, each one bringing them closer to a summit that many believed was beyond human reach. If you enjoy these explorations into real expeditions and the details that made them possible, consider liking, subscribing, or leaving a thought below. It helps others discover these stories, one curious mind at a time. But for now, if you're ready, let's begin our ascent. The year 1953 marked the culmination of over 3 decades of attempts to reach the summit of Mount Everest. The mountain had been a target of British expeditions since the early 1920s, when George Mallory famously responded to the question of why climb Everest with the simple answer, because it's there. But Mallory never returned from his 1924 attempt, disappearing somewhere high on the mountain's northeast ridge along with his climbing partner Andrew Irvine. Their fate remained one of mountaineering's greatest mysteries, and Everest remained unconquered. Throughout the 1920s and 1930s, multiple British expeditions approached Everest from the north, through Tibet. These attempts were launched from a base camp on the Tibetan side, and climbers pushed up the north ridge toward the summit. Each expedition learned something new about the mountain, its weather patterns, its technical difficulties, the effects of extreme altitude on the human body. But each also turned back, defeated by storms, by lack of oxygen, by exhaustion, by the sheer difficulty of moving at altitudes where the air contained only 1/3 the oxygen available at sea level. The Second World War interrupted these attempts, and when peace returned, the political landscape had changed dramatically. Tibet, previously accessible to Western expeditions, closed its borders. The new communist government of China, which now controlled Tibet, denied permission for climbing expeditions. This meant the northern approach to Everest was no longer available. But there was another route, one that had been glimpsed but never seriously attempted because of political complications in Nepal. The southern approach, through the Kingdom of Nepal, offered a different path to the summit. In 1950, Nepal opened its borders to foreigners for the first time in over a century. This opened up the possibility of approaching Everest from the south, through the Khumbu region, homeland of the Sherpa people who would prove essential to any climbing attempt. The southern route was unknown territory for climbers. No one had explored the Khumbu Icefall, the massive river of broken ice that guarded the approach to the mountain. No one had climbed through the western Khumbu, the vast glacial valley that led toward Everest's upper slopes. It was all unexplored, unmapped, and potentially impossible. The first expedition to seriously scout the southern route was a small British reconnaissance party in 1951. This team, which included Eric Shipton and Edmund Hillary, explored the Khumbu region and confirmed that a route to the summit might be possible from the south. They navigated partway through the treacherous Khumbu Icefall and glimpsed the western Khumbu beyond. Their report generated excitement and also concern. The route looked feasible, but it would be dangerous, requiring technical expertise, substantial resources, and careful planning. Then came 1952, a year that would prove crucial to understanding what it would take to climb Everest from the south. A Swiss expedition made 2 attempts that year, one in the spring and another in the autumn. The spring attempt came remarkably close to success. Raymond Lambert and Tenzing Norgay, who was serving as a Sherpa climber on the Swiss team, reached an altitude of about 8,600 meters, just 250 meters below the summit. They spent a night at 8,500 meters without supplemental oxygen, an incredible feat of endurance. But they couldn't go higher. Their oxygen equipment failed, the cold was overwhelming, and they had to turn back. The Swiss autumn attempt in 1952 also fell short, turned back by brutal winter conditions. But these expeditions proved several critical things. First, the southern route was viable. Second, climbers could reach extreme altitudes on this route, heights from which the summit appeared achievable. Third, the mountain was still ferociously difficult, and success would require perfect planning, excellent equipment, favorable weather, and perhaps some luck. The Swiss near success in 1952 created urgency in Britain. The British had been trying to climb Everest longer than anyone, and they wanted to be the first to succeed. There was national pride at stake, and also the knowledge that other nations, Switzerland, France, possibly even the Americans, were planning their own attempts. If Britain was going to claim Everest, it would need to move quickly. This urgency led to the organization of the 1953 British Everest expedition, the most carefully planned and comprehensively equipped expedition ever mounted on the mountain. The leadership of this expedition would fall to a man named John Hunt, a British Army officer and experienced Himalayan climber. Hunt's selection came after some controversy. Eric Shipton, who had led British expeditions to Everest in the past and had been expected to lead the 1953 attempt, was replaced by Hunt because the organizing committee felt they needed someone with military organizational skills and a more aggressive approach to reaching the summit. John Hunt was 42 years old in 1953, a colonel in the British Army, and a veteran of alpine and Himalayan climbing. He approached the Everest expedition like a military campaign, with detailed planning, careful logistics, and a clear strategy. Hunt's plan was to establish a series of camps up the mountain, each one stocked with supplies, oxygen, tents, and equipment. These camps would serve as stepping stones, allowing climbers to move up the mountain gradually, acclimatizing to the altitude, and positioning themselves for a summit attempt. The concept of establishing camps on a mountain is fundamental to high-altitude mountaineering, but on Everest it becomes absolutely essential. At sea level, the atmosphere exerts about 14.7 pounds per square inch of pressure, and the air contains roughly 21% oxygen. As altitude increases, atmospheric pressure decreases, meaning there are fewer oxygen molecules in each breath. At 5,500 meters, about 18,000 feet, atmospheric pressure is roughly half what it is at sea level. At Everest's summit, 8,848 meters or 29,029 feet, the pressure is about one-third of sea level pressure. This means climbers are trying to function with only about one-third of the oxygen their bodies normally use. The human body can acclimatize to reduced oxygen over time, producing more red blood cells to carry oxygen more efficiently, but this process takes weeks. Even with acclimatization, the upper reaches of Everest remain in what climbers call the death zone, altitudes above 8,000 meters where the human body cannot survive for extended periods. In the death zone, the body consumes itself, breaking down muscle tissue because it cannot get enough oxygen to sustain normal functions. Climbers lose weight rapidly, their judgment becomes impaired, frostbite becomes likely, and the risk of fatal altitude sickness increases dramatically. Because of these physiological realities, climbers cannot simply march up Everest from base camp to summit in one push. They need to ascend gradually, spending time at intermediate altitudes to allow their bodies to adjust. This is where the camp system becomes vital. By establishing a series of camps at progressively higher elevations, climbers can move up the mountain in stages, sleeping at each camp, acclimatizing, and then moving higher. When they finally make a summit attempt, they're coming from a high camp, having already acclimatized to much of the altitude, giving them a chance of success. Hunt's plan called for 8 camps on Everest, starting with base camp at about 5,400 meters or 17,900 feet. From there, the route would climb through the Khumbu Icefall to Camp 1 at about 6,100 meters or 20,000 feet. Camp 2, also called Advanced Base Camp, would sit in the western Khum at about 6,500 meters or 21,300 feet. Camp 3 would be placed at the base of the Lot's face at about 7,300 meters or 24,000 feet. Camp 4 would be on the Lot's face itself at about 7,400 meters or 24,500 feet. Camp 5 was planned for the Geneva Spur at about 7,900 meters or 25,900 feet. Camp 6 would be positioned on the South Col at 7,900 meters or 26,000 feet. And finally, Camp 7 and 8 would be established above the South Col, with Camp 8, the highest, positioned at about 8,500 meters or 27,900 feet, within striking distance of the summit. Each of these camps would need to be stocked with tents, sleeping bags, cooking equipment, food, fuel, oxygen bottles, and climbing gear. All of this equipment would need to be carried up the mountain by the expedition's climbers and Sherpas. The logistics were staggering. To keep a high camp supplied, you needed multiple lower camps already established and stocked. To stock those lower camps, you needed supplies ferried up from base camp. And to get everything to base camp, you needed hundreds of porters carrying loads from the nearest roadhead, a journey of many days through the foothills of the Himalayas. Hunt assembled a strong team for this expedition. The climbing team included some of Britain's best mountaineers. There was Edmund Hillary, a 33-year-old beekeeper from New Zealand who had impressed on the 1951 reconnaissance and had been climbing in the Himalayas since the late 1940s. There was Charles Evans, a brain surgeon and experienced climber. Tom Bourdillon, a physicist and alpinist. George Lowe, another New Zealander and a close friend of Hillary's. Wilfred Noyce, an author and mountaineer. Michael Westmacott, Alfred Gregory, Michael Ward, and Griffith Pugh, who served as the expedition's physiologist. And then there was Tenzing Norgay, who would play a central role in the expedition's success. Tenzing was a Sherpa, born in the Khumbu region near Everest, though the exact details of his birth are somewhat uncertain, likely around 1914. Tenzing had been on Everest 6 times before 1953, more than any other person alive. He had served as a porter, a high-altitude climber, and a Sirdar, a lead Sherpa responsible for organizing the Sherpa team. He had climbed with the Swiss in 1952 and reached that incredible height of 8,600 meters. By 1953, Tenzing was the most experienced high-altitude climber in the world, and Hunt recognized that he was not just a support climber but a full member of the summit team. The Sherpa team was essential to the expedition's success. Sherpas are an ethnic group living in the high valleys of Nepal, near the Tibetan border. They have lived at high altitudes for generations and have genetic adaptations that help them function better in low-oxygen environments. Sherpas have larger lung capacities, more efficient oxygen processing, and greater endurance at altitude than most lowlanders. They also have intimate knowledge of the Himalayas, experience with mountain travel, and extraordinary toughness. For the 1953 expedition, Hunt recruited a team of experienced Sherpas who would work as high-altitude porters, carrying loads between camps, fixing ropes on difficult sections, and supporting the summit climbers. These Sherpas included men like Angnima, D.A. Namgyal, Anulu, Angtemba, and many others. Their contributions would be as vital as those of the British climbers, though they often received less recognition in the expedition accounts written afterward. The expedition also required a small army of porters to carry all the equipment and supplies from the roadhead at Kathmandu to base camp. In total, the 1953 expedition employed about 362 porters for the approach march, carrying approximately 10 tons of equipment and food. This included 20 Sherpa porters who would continue with the expedition as high-altitude support, while the lowland porters would return home once everything reached base camp. The equipment for the expedition reflected the best technology available in 1953, though by modern standards it seems primitive. Climbers wore wool clothing, gabardine windproof suits, leather boots with crampons strapped on, down jackets, and woolen gloves. They slept in canvas tents, cooked on kerosene stoves, and drank from metal water bottles. The climbing ropes were made of hemp and nylon, the ice axes were long and heavy, and the crampons had only 10 or 12 points. Oxygen equipment was recognized as essential for climbing above 8,000 meters, the death zone. The expedition brought along two types of oxygen systems, one heavier and more reliable open-circuit system, and a lighter closed-circuit system that recycled exhaled air but was less dependable. Each system consisted of oxygen bottles, regulators, valves, and face masks. The bottles were heavy, and climbers could only carry a limited supply, meaning careful rationing was necessary. Hunt's plan called for using oxygen starting from the South Col at 7,900 meters during the final push toward the summit. The expedition's food supplies were carefully chosen for high altitude. At extreme elevations, climbers often lose their appetites and have difficulty digesting heavy foods. The menu included lightweight items like soups, tea, chocolate, sardines, dried fruits, biscuits, and condensed milk. At lower camps, climbers enjoyed heartier meals, including tinned meats, cheeses, bread, and jam. At base camp, there was even fresh food brought in periodically by porters from nearby villages. One crucial innovation for the 1953 expedition was the careful attention to hydration. Griffith Pugh, the expedition's physiologist, recognized that dehydration was a serious problem at high altitude. The cold, dry air caused climbers to lose moisture with every breath, and many previous expeditions had suffered from severe dehydration without realizing it. Pugh insisted that climbers drink large quantities of fluids, melting snow, and ice for water throughout the day. This focus on hydration would prove to be one of the factors that gave the 1953 team an edge over previous attempts. The expedition departed from England in February 1953, traveling by ship to India and then overland to Kathmandu, Nepal. From Kathmandu, the real journey began. The team, along with hundreds of porters carrying supplies, trekked for about 2 weeks through the foothills and valleys of Nepal, following trails that wound through terraced fields, rhododendron forests, and Sherpa villages. This approach march was not just about covering distance. It was also the first stage of acclimatization, allowing the climbers' bodies to begin adjusting to altitude as they moved from Kathmandu at about 1,400 meters to progressively higher elevations. The route passed through villages like Banipa, Risingo, and those where the expedition could rest and resupply. The team crossed rivers on suspension bridges made of rope and wood, climbed steep hillsides, and descended into valleys, always moving generally eastward and upward toward the Khumbu region. The scenery was spectacular, with views of terraced farms, forests filled with flowering rhododendrons in the spring bloom, and distant snowy peaks appearing on the horizon. As the expedition moved higher, the landscape changed. The subtropical forests of the lower elevations gave way to pine and fir forests, and then to alpine meadows and rocky terrain. The air grew thinner, the nights colder, and the villages more sparse. The trail passed through Namche Bazaar, the main Sherpa town in the Khumbu, situated at about 3,400 meters or 11,300 feet. Namche was a bustling market town where Sherpa traders brought goods from Tibet and lowland Nepal. The expedition spent time here, resting, organizing supplies, and allowing everyone to acclimatize to the altitude. From Namche, the route continued up the Dud Kosi Valley toward the Khumbu Glacier and the base of Everest. The team passed through the village of Tengboche, where a Buddhist monastery sat on a ridge with spectacular views of Everest, Lhotse, and Amadablam. The monks at Tengboche blessed the expedition, performing a puja ceremony to ask for safe passage on the mountain. This ceremony was important to the Sherpa members of the team, who viewed the mountains as sacred and wanted to show respect to the gods believed to dwell on the peaks. Beyond Tengboche, the landscape became increasingly barren and rocky. The tree line was left behind, and the trail wound through a stark, beautiful world of stone and ice. The team crossed moraines, piles of rock and debris left by glacier, and camped beside frozen streams. The nights were bitterly cold, with temperatures dropping far below freezing. During the day, the sun was intense at this altitude, reflecting off snow and rock, and climbers had to wear sunglasses or goggles to prevent snow blindness. Finally, after about 2 weeks of trekking, the expedition reached the site chosen for base camp, at the foot of the Khumbu Icefall at about 5,400 meters or 17,900 feet. This location, on the Khumbu Glacier, would serve as the expedition's home for the next 2 months. Base camp was established on April 12, 1953, and the real work of climbing Everest was about to begin. Setting up base camp was a major undertaking. The expedition's tents were erected on the rocky moraine beside the glacier. Storage tents were set up for food, equipment, and oxygen bottles. A kitchen tent was established, where Sherpa cooks prepared meals over kerosene stoves. There was a mess tent where the team gathered for meals and meetings. And there were sleeping tents for the climbers and Sherpas, each one a small canvas shelter against the cold. The location of base camp was both strategic and practical. It was positioned as high as possible on the glacier while still being relatively safe from avalanches and below the technical climbing of the Khumbu Icefall. From base camp, the team could look up at the towering wall of ice that blocked their route toward the summit. The Khumbu Icefall rose above them, a chaotic jumble of ice blocks, crevasses, and unstable seracs that moved and shifted constantly. Beyond the icefall, hidden from view, was the western Khumbu, and beyond that, the upper slopes of Everest leading to the summit. Base camp would serve as the expedition's supply depot, communication center, and staging area for the entire 2-month climbing effort. It was also a place of relative safety and comfort, at least compared to the higher camps. At base camp, climbers could rest, recover from their efforts higher on the mountain, and plan the next stages of the ascent. There was mail delivered periodically by runners from Kathmandu, bringing letters from home. There were books to read, journals to write, and conversations around the mess tent in the evenings. But base camp was also the starting point for the most dangerous and difficult work of the expedition. From here, the team would begin the process of establishing the chain of camps up the mountain, each one a step closer to the summit and each one requiring enormous effort and risk to create. The mountain itself, the target of all this planning and effort, towered above them in a way that's almost impossible to convey in words. Mount Everest is not just the highest point on Earth. It's a mountain that dominates the landscape, visible from over 200 kilometers away on clear days. From base camp, looking up at the route ahead, the climbers could see only the lower sections, the icefall, a glimpse of the western Khumbu beyond. The upper mountain was hidden by the intervening ridges and walls of rock and ice. But everyone knew what was up there, almost 3,500 vertical meters of climbing through some of the most hostile terrain on the planet. Everest sits on the border between Nepal and Tibet, part of the Himalaya mountain range formed by the collision of the Indian and Eurasian tectonic plates over 50 million years ago. The mountain is still rising, pushed upward by tectonic forces at a rate of about 4 millimeters per year. The summit of Everest is made of marine limestone, rock that once lay on an ancient seafloor and has been thrust up to the roof of the world by the slow, inexorable movement of continents. The mountain has 3 main faces: the north face, which rises from Tibet, the south face, which rises from Nepal and includes the route that Hillary and Tenzing would climb, and the east or Kangshung face, considered one of the most dangerous walls in mountaineering. The summit itself is a small snow-covered platform, barely large enough for a few people to stand, exposed to winds that can exceed 200 kilometers per hour. Everest's weather is notoriously severe. The mountain sits at a latitude where the jet stream, a high-altitude wind current, often flows directly over the summit. When the jet stream is positioned over Everest, the summit experiences hurricane-force winds that make climbing impossible. These winds can blow snow and ice with such force that climbers caught in them have no chance of survival. The only times when climbing to the summit is feasible are during brief windows when the jet stream moves north, typically in May before the monsoon arrives, and sometimes in October after the monsoon ends. Temperature on Everest is brutally cold. At the summit, temperatures regularly drop to -40 degrees Celsius or lower, and with wind chill, it can feel much colder. Frostbite is a constant danger, and climbers must protect every bit of exposed skin. Even in the relative warmth of midday sun at lower elevations, the cold remains intense. At night, temperatures plunge, and climbers huddle in their sleeping bags, trying to stay warm enough to sleep. The terrain of Everest is varied and treacherous. The Khumbu Icefall is a river of ice, part of the Khumbu Glacier, that flows down from the western Khum at a steep angle. The glacier moves about 1 meter per day, and this movement causes the ice to fracture and break into massive blocks called seracs, some as large as office buildings. Crevasses, deep fissures in the ice, open and close unpredictably. Some crevasses are narrow enough to step over, others are wide enough to swallow a house. Climbing through the icefall means navigating around and over these obstacles, crossing crevasses on ladders, threading between unstable seracs that can collapse without warning. Above the icefall is the Western Khum, pronounced Coombe, a Welsh word for valley. The Western Khum is a vast glacial valley enclosed by towering walls of rock and ice. Everest forms the northern boundary, Nupt's the southern. The valley floor is relatively flat but heavily crevassed, and in the daytime it becomes a sun trap, with temperatures rising above freezing despite the altitude. Climbers often travel through the Western Khum at night or early morning to avoid the heat and the increased avalanche danger from snow melting on the surrounding slopes. At the far end of the Western Khum rises the Lot's Face, a massive wall of ice that climbers must ascend to reach the South Col. The Lot's Face is steep, requiring fixed ropes for safety, and it's exposed to avalanches from the slopes above. Climbers on the Lot's Face are in the death zone, and they move slowly, gasping for breath in the thin air. The South Col is a high, windswept saddle between Everest and Lot's, at 7,900 meters or 26,000 feet. It's a desolate place, littered with rocks and wind-scoured ice, exposed to the full force of the jet stream when it passes overhead. The South Col is where climbers establish their highest camps before the summit push. From the South Col, the route continues up the southeast ridge toward the summit, passing over rocky terrain and steep snow slopes, crossing the Hillary Step, a near-vertical rock face just below the summit, and finally reaching the top of the world. This was the mountain that the 1953 expedition set out to climb. This was the challenge that had defeated every previous attempt. And this was the terrain where Hillary, Tenzing, and their teammates would need to establish a chain of camps, each one a foothold in the sky, each one bringing them closer to their goal. The first major obstacle was the Khumbu Icefall, and it would prove to be one of the most dangerous sections of the entire route. The icefall starts just above base camp and rises about 600 meters over a distance of about 2 kilometers. It's a maze of crevasses, ice towers, and unstable seracs. The ice is constantly moving, creaking, groaning, and occasionally collapsing with a sound like thunder. Climbers entering the icefall know that they're taking their lives in their hands. There's no safe path through. Every route is a gamble, and even the most experienced climbers can be caught by a collapsing serac or fall into a hidden crevasse. Hunt assigned the task of finding and marking a route through the icefall to a team led by Edmund Hillary and George Lowe, along with several Sherpas. This was difficult, dangerous work. the route-finding team left base camp before dawn, when the ice was most stable due to the cold, and spent hours probing for safe paths, testing snow bridges over crevasses, and placing marker flags to guide later climbers. Hillary and Lowe worked methodically, crossing crevasses by laying aluminum ladders across them, secured with ropes. Some crevasses required multiple ladders lashed together to span the gap. The climbers moved carefully, testing each step, knowing that a mistake could send them tumbling into the depths. When they encountered seracs too large to climb over, they looked for ways around or through. Sometimes they had to carve steps in the ice with their axes, or fix ropes to help climbers pull themselves up steep sections. The route through the icefall changed constantly. Each morning, the route-finding team had to check the path they'd established the previous day, repairing sections where the ice had shifted, finding new routes around collapses, replacing ladders that had fallen into crevasses. It was exhausting, nerve-wracking work, and everyone knew that the icefall was one of the deadliest parts of the mountain. In later years, the Khumbu Icefall would claim more lives than any other section of the Everest route, and even in 1953, the climbers understood the risks they were taking every time they entered it. By mid-April, the route through the icefall was established, and the expedition began the work of carrying loads up to Camp 1. This was the start of the supply chain that would be essential to the summit attempt. Climbers and Sherpas would carry heavy loads, often 15 to 20 kilograms each, from base camp through the icefall to Camp 1, deposit the supplies, and then descend back to base camp. Then they'd do it again the next day, and the day after that, gradually building up a stockpile of equipment at Camp 1. Camp 1 was established at about 6,100 meters or 20,000 feet, just above the icefall in a relatively flat area on the glacier. The camp consisted of several tents pitched on the ice, stocked with food, fuel, sleeping bags, oxygen bottles, and climbing gear. It served as the first staging point for further progress up the mountain. From Camp 1, the team could look back down at the chaos of the icefall they'd just climbed through, and ahead at the western Khumbu, stretching away toward the base of Lhotse. Establishing Camp 1 and keeping it supplied required dozens of carries through the icefall. Each carry was dangerous and exhausting. Climbers left base camp in the early morning darkness, climbed for 3 or 4 hours through the icefall, reached Camp 1, dropped their loads, rested briefly, and then descended back to base camp, often arriving in the afternoon exhausted and sunburned. Then they'd rest for a day or two before making another carry. The Sherpas, tougher and more acclimatized than most of the Western climbers, often made more carries and carried heavier loads. As Camp 1 became established, the expedition began pushing further up the Western Khumbu toward the site of Camp 2. The Western Khumbu was a relief after the icefall, relatively flat and without the constant danger of collapsing seracs. But it had its own challenges. The valley floor was crevassed, requiring careful route finding and the occasional ladder crossing. And during the daytime, the Khumbu became unbearably hot, with temperatures rising above freezing and the sun's reflection off the snow causing severe sunburn and heat exhaustion. The team decided to do much of their travel through the Western Khumbu at night or in the early morning, when the temperature was lower and the snow firmer. This meant climbing by headlamp, following the route marked by flags and bamboo wands left by the advance parties. It was eerie and beautiful, moving through the silent valley under the stars, the towering walls of Everest and Nukt rising on either side, the crunch of crampons on snow the only sound. Camp 2, also known as Advanced Base Camp, was established at about 6,500 meters or 21,300 feet in the middle of the Western Khumbu. This camp was more substantial than Camp 1, intended as a semi-permanent base for the upper mountain. The tents were larger, and there were more supplies stockpiled here, enough food, fuel, and oxygen to support the summit push. Camp 2 became the expedition's operational headquarters, the place where climbers rested between carries to higher camps and where plans were made for the next stages of the ascent. From Camp 2, Looking up toward the head of the western Khumbu, the climbers could see the Lot's face rising ahead, a massive wall of blue ice gleaming in the sun. That was where the next camps would go, and that was where the real technical climbing would begin. But first, more supplies needed to be carried up from Camp 1, and the climbers needed more time to acclimatize to the altitude. Acclimatization was a constant concern. Even though the climbers had been at altitude for weeks, moving from base camp to Camp 1 and Camp 2, their bodies were still struggling to adapt. Some climbers suffered from headaches, nausea, and loss of appetite, symptoms of altitude sickness. Others felt strong and ready to go higher. Hunt carefully managed the climbing roster, making sure that each climber spent enough time at altitude to acclimatize but didn't overextend themselves. One of the innovations of the 1953 expedition was the systematic use of oxygen for sleeping at high camps. Previous expeditions had saved oxygen for the summit push, but Hunt, following advice from the expedition's physiologist Griffith Pugh, decided that climbers would benefit from using oxygen while sleeping at camps above a certain altitude. This allowed climbers to recover better overnight, maintain their strength, and reduce the cumulative effects of altitude. It was a new approach, and it seemed to be working. The climbers using oxygen to sleep reported feeling much better in the mornings. By late April, Camps 1 and 2 were well established and stocked. The expedition was ready to push higher, toward Camp 3 on the Lot's face and eventually to the South Col and beyond. But the work had been hard. Several climbers were showing signs of exhaustion, and Hunt had to rotate people down to base camp to rest and recover. The weather had been mostly good, with clear days and only occasional storms, but everyone knew that the weather window wouldn't last forever. The monsoon season was approaching, bringing heavy snow and making climbing impossible. The expedition had a limited amount of time to reach the summit before conditions deteriorated. The process of establishing these camps, Camp 1 and Camp 2, had taken about 2 weeks of intense effort. Dozens of loads had been carried through the icefall. Tents had been pitched, supplies organized, routes marked with flags and wands. The expedition had established a foothold on the mountain, a presence in the western Khumbu, and a base from which to launch the next phase of the climb. It was exhausting, repetitive work, but it was essential. Without these lower camps stocked and secure, there would be no chance of establishing the higher camps needed for a summit attempt. The teamwork required for this effort was extraordinary. Climbers and Sherpas worked side by side, each person contributing according to their abilities. Some climbers were stronger at altitude and could carry heavier loads. Others were better at technical climbing and took the lead on difficult sections. The Sherpas, with their years of experience and natural acclimatization, were invaluable. They carried enormous loads, often more than the Western climbers, and they did it with a cheerfulness and competence that earned everyone's respect. Tenzing Norgay, in particular, was proving to be a key figure. As Sirdar, he was responsible for organizing the Sherpa team, assigning tasks, and ensuring that everyone was working effectively. But Tenzing was also climbing high on the mountain himself, carrying loads to Camp 2 and preparing for even higher efforts. His experience from the 1952 Swiss expedition meant he knew what to expect on the upper mountain, and his advice was sought by Hunt and the other climbers. Tenzing had a quiet confidence and a determination that inspired the team. Edmund Hillary was also distinguishing himself. Hillary was strong, fast, and seemingly tireless at altitude. He'd been instrumental in finding the route through the icefall, and he'd made multiple carries to Camp 1 and Camp 2, often carrying loads heavier than most other climbers. Hillary had a straightforward, no-nonsense approach to climbing. He didn't complain, he didn't hesitate, he just got on with the work. His partnership with George Lowe, his fellow New Zealander and close friend, was effective and efficient. The two of them worked well together, understanding each other's strengths and supporting each other on the mountain. The weather during this period was a mix of clear, cold days and occasional storms. When the weather was good, the team pushed hard, making multiple carries and advancing the route. When storms moved in, everyone retreated to base camp or the lower camps to wait out the bad weather. These rest periods were important, giving climbers time to recover, eat, and regain their strength. Life at the camps was basic but functional. At base camp, there was a sense of organization and routine. Meals were prepared at set times, there were scheduled meetings to discuss plans, and there was even a certain amount of comfort, with mail from home, books to read, and conversation in the mess tent. At Camp 1 and Camp 2, conditions were more Spartan. Tents were small and crowded, cooking was done on temperamental kerosene stoves that often clogged or malfunctioned, and everything was cold. Water had to be melted from snow, a tedious process that consumed fuel and time. Sleep was difficult at altitude, with many climbers waking frequently, gasping for breath or suffering from headaches. Despite the hardships, there was a sense of purpose and excitement. The team was making progress. The camps were being established. The route was becoming clearer. And the summit, though still far above and hidden from view, was beginning to feel like a real possibility rather than just a distant dream. As May arrived, the expedition moved into the next phase of the climb, pushing higher toward the Lot's Face and the South Col. This would be the most difficult and dangerous part of the route, the section that would determine whether the expedition succeeded or failed. The lower camps were secure, stocked with supplies, and connected by a route that had been climbed and descended dozens of times. Now the real test would begin, the climb into the death zone, where every breath was a struggle and every step required immense effort. But before we follow the climbers up into those extreme heights, it's worth pausing to appreciate what had already been accomplished. In the space of about 3 weeks, the expedition had traveled from Kathmandu to base camp, established 2 major camps on the mountain, and created a supply line that could support further progress. They had navigated the deadly Khumbu Icefall, crossed the western Khum, and positioned themselves for the next stage of the ascent. All of this had been done through hard, dangerous work, through teamwork and determination, and through the skills and experience of climbers and Sherpas working together toward a common goal. The camps themselves, simple canvas tents pitched on ice and rock, were more than just shelters. They were statements of human intention, small outposts of warmth and life in a landscape that seemed designed to repel human presence. Each camp represented hours of effort, dozens of carries, careful planning, and constant vigilance. Each camp was a step toward the summit, a foothold on the mountain, a place where climbers could rest and prepare for the next push higher. And as the expedition prepared to move into the upper reaches of Everest, into the zones where the air was thin enough to kill and the cold was severe enough to freeze flesh in minutes, those camps would become even more important. They would be the lifeline, the retreat in case of trouble, the supply depots that made a summit attempt possible. Without them, there would be no chance of success. With them, the door to the summit was open, at least a crack. The story of Everest in 1953 is often told as the story of Hillary and Tenzing reaching the summit, and rightfully so. That moment on the summit was the culmination of decades of attempts and the fulfillment of a dream. But the summit was only possible because of the camps, because of the route through the icefall, because of the supplies carried up by dozens of people over weeks of effort. The summit was the goal, but the camps were the means, the foundation upon which success was built. As we prepare to follow the climbers higher up Everest, into the death zone and toward their ultimate goal, it's important to remember that every step they took was built on the steps that came before. Every camp they slept in was stocked by someone who carried supplies up from below. Every rope they clipped into was fixed by someone who climbed that section first. Mountaineering at this level is a team effort, a collective endeavor where success depends on everyone doing their part. And in 1953, on the slopes of Everest, that team effort was about to be tested to its limits. By early May, With camps 1 and 2 securely established and well stocked, the expedition turned its attention to the most technically challenging section of the climb, the Lot's Face, and the establishment of the higher camps that would enable a summit attempt. The Lot's Face is a massive wall of ice rising about 1,100 meters from the head of the western Khumbu to the South Col. It's steep, averaging about 40 to 45 degrees, but with sections approaching 60 degrees, steep enough that climbers cannot simply walk up but must use ice axes and crampons, kicking steps into the hard ice and pulling themselves upward. The Lot's Face presented several significant challenges. First, there was the technical difficulty of climbing such a steep ice slope at extreme altitude. Second, the face was exposed to avalanches from the slopes above, particularly from the hanging glacier on the west shoulder of Lot's. Third, the altitude meant that climbers would be entering the death zone, above 8,000 meters, where the human body begins to deteriorate rapidly. And fourth, the face was so large that climbers would need to establish at least 2 camps on it, Camp 3 and Camp 4, to break the climb into manageable stages. The first task was to find a safe route up the Lot's Face and fix ropes on the steepest sections. Fixed ropes are essential on difficult terrain at high altitude. They're permanent ropes anchored to the ice or rock that climbers can clip into with carabiners, providing security in case of a fall and something to pull on when climbing steep sections. Fixing ropes on the Lot's Face would require climbers to lead the route, placing ice screws and snow stakes as anchors, and running rope from anchor to anchor up the face. Wilfred Noyce and Sherpa Analu were given the task of pushing the route up the lower Lot's Face. On May 2nd, they set out from Camp 2, climbed to the head of the western Khumbu, and began working their way up the ice face. The climbing was difficult and exhausting. At this altitude, over 7,000 meters, every step required multiple breaths. The climbers would take a few steps, stop to gasp for air, take a few more steps, stop again. Progress was measured in tens of meters per hour rather than hundreds. Noyce and Analu climbed for several hours, fixing rope as they went, until they reached a suitable spot for Camp 3 at about 7,300 meters or 24,000 feet. This was a small shelf carved into the ice face, barely large enough for a couple of tents. They marked the location and descended back to Camp 2, exhausted but satisfied with the day's work. Over the next several days, other climbers continued pushing the route higher, fixing more rope and carrying loads up to the site of Camp 3. Establishing Camp 3 required multiple carries from Camp 2. Tents, sleeping bags, food, fuel, oxygen bottles, all of it had to be carried up the steep ice face. Each carry was a supreme effort. Climbers would leave Camp 2 in the early morning, climb for hours up the western Khumbu and then up the fixed ropes on the Lot's Face, reach Camp 3, deposit their loads, and then descend. By the time they returned to Camp 2, they were completely spent, needing a day or more to recover before making another carry. The Sherpas once again proved their incredible strength and endurance. They carried loads up to Camp 3 that were often heavier than those carried by the Western climbers, and they did it repeatedly, day after day. Their performance was remarkable and essential to the expedition's success. Without the Sherpas carrying the bulk of the supplies, the expedition could never have stocked the high camps adequately. Camp 3 was a harsh place. The tents were pitched on narrow ledges chopped into the ice face, and there was constant awareness of the exposure, the steep drop below and the avalanche danger from above. The wind was stronger here, buffeting the tents and making sleep difficult. The cold was intense, well below freezing even during the day. Climbers sleeping at Camp 3 used oxygen to help them rest, but even with oxygen, sleep was fitful and unsatisfying. From Camp 3, the route continued up the Lot's Face toward Camp 4. The upper section of the face was even steeper and more exposed than the lower section. The ice here was hard as rock, requiring every ounce of strength to kick steps and swing ice axes. The fixed ropes were essential, and climbers hauled themselves up hand over hand, their crampons scratching for purchase on the glassy surface. George Low and several Sherpas pushed the route higher, fixing rope all the way to a site for Camp 4 at about 7,400 meters or 24,500 feet. This camp was even more precarious than Camp 3, perched on a small platform on the face with staggering exposure. But it was necessary as a staging point for the next section of the climb, the traverse to the South Col. Stocking Camp 4 required even more carries, each one more exhausting than the last. The altitude was taking a toll on everyone. Appetites disappeared, and climbers had to force themselves to eat and drink. Weight loss was noticeable, with climbers losing several kilograms each week despite consuming large amounts of food when they could stomach it. The lack of oxygen at this altitude meant that the body was consuming itself, breaking down muscle tissue to fuel basic functions. Despite these hardships, the expedition pushed on. Hunt's organizational skills and planning were evident in the systematic way the camps were established and supplied. He maintained a careful record of who was carrying what and where, ensuring that the right supplies were in the right places. He also rotated climbers between high camps and base camp, giving everyone time to recover before asking them to go back up. By mid-May, Camps 3 and 4 were established on the Lot's face, stocked with supplies and ready to support the next phase of the climb. The next major objective was the South Col, the high, windswept saddle at 7,900 meters or 26,000 feet that would serve as the launch point for the summit attempts. Reaching the South Col required traversing from Camp 4 across a steep section of the Lot's face and then scrambling up rocky terrain called the Geneva Spur. On May 21, Wilfred Noyce and Sherpa Anulu made the first successful push to the South Col from Camp 4. They carried loads of supplies and equipment, breaking trail through deep snow and establishing a route that others could follow. Reaching the South Col was a significant achievement, a milestone that marked the expedition's entry into the final phase of the climb. The South Col had only been reached once before, by the Swiss expedition in 1952, and getting there from the Nepal side demonstrated that the route was viable. The South Col itself is one of the most desolate places on Earth. It's a broad, rocky plateau strewn with stones and ice, constantly scoured by savage winds. When the jet stream passes over Everest, the South Col bears the full brunt of its fury, with winds that can exceed 150 km per hour, making it impossible to stand upright. Even on relatively calm days, the wind is fierce, and the cold is extreme. The South Col has been described as a place that seems designed to kill anything living that ventures there. But despite its harshness, the South Col was essential to the expedition's plans. This was where Camp 6 would be established, the highest camp from which the summit attempts would be launched. Over the next several days, more climbers and Sherpas carried loads to the South Col, gradually building up a stockpile of oxygen, food, fuel, and climbing gear. Tents were pitched in the lee of rocks to provide some shelter from the wind. The camp was basic and uncomfortable, but it was in position. Hunt's plan called for 2 summit attempts. The first attempt would be made by Tom Bourdelon and Charles Evans using the closed-circuit oxygen system, which was lighter but less reliable. If they succeeded, excellent. If not, they would hopefully reach a high point, break trail, and provide valuable information for the second attempt. The second attempt would be made by Edmund Hillary and Tenzing Norgay using the heavier but more reliable open-circuit oxygen system. This decision about summit pairs was both strategic and sensitive. Hunt had originally planned to include himself in one of the summit attempts, but as the expedition progressed, he realized that he wasn't acclimatizing as well as some of the younger climbers. In a display of leadership and selflessness, Hunt decided to step aside and allow the strongest climbers to make the attempts. His role would be to support them, to organize the logistics, and to ensure that everything was in place for success. The selection of Hillary and Tenzing as the second summit pair was significant. Tenzing was not just a Sherpa porter but a full climbing member of the team, recognized for his experience and ability. Pairing him with Hillary, one of the strongest Western climbers, created a formidable team. It also sent a message about the partnership between the Western climbers and the Sherpas, a recognition that success on Everest was a shared achievement. As the expedition prepared for the summit attempts, there was a sense of anticipation and nervousness. Everyone knew that they were close, closer than any expedition had been except for the Swiss in 1952. But everyone also knew how many things could go wrong. The weather could deteriorate, trapping climbers on the mountain. Equipment could fail at a critical moment. A climber could fall ill or be injured. Avalanches could sweep away camps or cut off retreat routes. There were 1,000 ways for the expedition to fail, and only a narrow path to success. The weather in late May was holding, with clear days and light winds, but the monsoon was approaching. The monsoon typically arrives in early June, bringing heavy snow and making climbing impossible. The expedition had a window of perhaps 2 weeks to make their attempts before conditions would force them to retreat. There was no time to waste. On May 26, the first summit attempt began. Bourdelon and Evans, along with Hunt and Sherpa Da Namgyal, climbed from the South Col toward the summit. Hunt and Da Namgyal's role was to carry supplies as high as possible to establish a high camp, Camp 8, at about 8,500 meters or 27,900 feet. This camp would serve as the launch point for Hillary and Tenzing's attempt. Hunt and Da Namgyal climbed magnificently, reaching about 8,350 meters before depositing their loads and descending, exhausted but satisfied with their effort. They had established a cache of oxygen and supplies at a height that would give the second summit pair a real chance. Meanwhile, Bourdelon and Evans continued upward, climbing toward the south summit, a subsidiary peak at about 8,750 meters, just 100 meters below the true summit. The climbing was desperately difficult. The ridge was narrow and exposed, with steep drops on both sides. The altitude was debilitating, and even with supplemental oxygen, the climbers could barely move. They would take a few steps, rest, gasping for breath, then take a few more steps. By early afternoon, Bourdelon and Evans reached the south summit, an incredible achievement. They were higher than any human had ever been, standing on a tiny snow platform with the true summit visible ahead. The summit was tantalizingly close, perhaps an hour's climb away. But both climbers realized they were in trouble. Their oxygen systems were malfunctioning, giving them less oxygen than they needed. They were exhausted, and the time was getting late. If they pushed onto the summit, they might not make it back to the South Col before dark, and a night out at that altitude, without shelter, would almost certainly be fatal. Making the agonizing decision to turn back, Bourdelon and Evans descended. It was a wise choice, though it must have been heartbreaking to turn around so close to the goal. Their attempt had proven that the south summit was reachable and had broken trail that would make things easier for the next attempt. They had also learned valuable lessons about oxygen systems and timing that would benefit Hillary and Tenzing. Bourdelon and Evans staggered back into Camp 6 on the South Col that evening, utterly spent. Evans was suffering from severe exhaustion and possible altitude sickness, and Bourdelon was not much better. Both men would need to descend to lower camps to recover. They had given everything they had, and they had come heartbreakingly close. Now it was up to Hillary and Tenzing. On the morning of May 28, the two climbers, along with George Low, Alfred Gregory, and Sherpa Ang Nima, set out from the South Col carrying supplies to establish Camp 8. The weather was good, with light winds and clear skies, perfect conditions for a summit attempt. The team climbed steadily up the southeast ridge, following the route that Bourdelon and Evans had pioneered 2 days earlier. By mid-afternoon, they reached the site where Hunt and Da Namgyal had left their supply cache, at about 8,500 meters. This would be Camp 8, the highest camp on the mountain, a tiny platform chopped into the snow on a ridge with dizzying exposure on both sides. Low, Gregory, and Nima helped Hillary and Tenzing set up a small tent, consolidate the oxygen bottles, and organize the supplies. Then, with good wishes and encouragement, the support team descended back to the South Col, leaving Hillary and Tenzing alone at Camp 8. That night was one of the most significant in mountaineering history, though no one could know it at the time. Hillary and Tenzing lay in their small tent, perched on the side of Everest at 8,500 meters, preparing for the summit attempt that would come at dawn. They melted snow for water, forcing themselves to drink as much as possible to stay hydrated. They ate a little food, though neither had much appetite. They checked and rechecked their oxygen equipment, making sure everything was functioning properly. And they tried to sleep, though sleep at that altitude was almost impossible, even with supplemental oxygen. The night was bitterly cold, probably around -30 degrees Celsius. The wind rattled the tent, and both men could hear the occasional roar of avalanches somewhere on the mountain. They were in the death zone, higher than any camp had ever been established before, and they knew that they had only a brief window to make their attempt. If they didn't reach the summit the next day, they would be too weak to try again. This was their chance, and they both knew it. As the first light of dawn touched the summit of Everest on May 29, 1953, Hillary and Tenzing prepared to leave Camp 8 and make their bid for the top of the world. They had done everything they could to prepare. The camps were established, the route was broken, the supplies were in place. Now it came down to this: 2 men, a mountain, and a dream that had eluded climbers for over 30 years. The camps that had been established over the past 6 weeks, from base camp at 5,400 meters to Camp 8 at 8,500 meters, were the foundation of this summit attempt. Each camp represented countless hours of effort, dozens of carries by climbers and Sherpas, careful planning, and constant vigilance. The camps were more than just places to sleep. They were supply depots, safe havens, and stepping stones that allowed climbers to acclimatize and position themselves for the final push. The camp system on Everest is a masterpiece of logistical planning. It's a pyramid of effort, with many loads carried to the lower camps, fewer to the middle camps, and only the essential supplies reaching the highest camps. At each stage, climbers and Sherpas work together to move equipment higher, creating a chain of support that extended from the relative safety of base camp to the extreme danger of the death zone. Without these camps, there would have been no summit attempt. Without the tireless work of Sherpas and climbers carrying loads day after day, there would have been no supplies at the high camps. Without the route-finding teams who fixed ropes and marked paths, there would have been no safe passage through the Khumbu Icefall and up the Lot's face. The summit, when it came, would be the achievement of 2 men standing on top, but it was built on the efforts of dozens who made that moment possible. As Hillary and Tenzing began their climb from Camp 8 on that morning of May 29th, they carried with them not just their own hopes and determination but the collective effort of an entire expedition. They climbed on ropes fixed by others, followed a route broken by those who had gone before, and relied on camps established and stocked by teammates. They were the tip of a very long spear, the culmination of weeks of effort by many people working toward a single goal. The climb from Camp 8 to the summit would take them about 5 hours, 5 hours of some of the most difficult climbing imaginable. They would cross steep snow slopes, scramble over rocky sections, navigate narrow ridges with 1,000-meter drops on either side, and finally confront the Hillary Step, a near-vertical rock face at 8,790 meters that would require technical climbing skills at an altitude where most people can barely stand. But before they could even attempt these challenges, they had to leave Camp 8 in the darkness before dawn, their headlamps casting small pools of light in the vast darkness of the mountain. They had to trust their equipment, their skills, and each other. They had to believe that they could do what no one had done before, stand on the highest point on Earth and return safely. The story of the 1953 British Everest expedition is often reduced to a simple narrative: Hillary and Tenzing climbed Everest. But the full story is so much richer and more complex. It's a story of teamwork, of careful planning, of physical endurance and mental toughness, of Sherpas and Western climbers working side by side, of camps established in impossible places, of supplies carried through deadly terrain, of leaders making difficult decisions, of climbers turning back when necessary and pushing forward when possible. It's a story about what humans can accomplish when they work together toward a common goal, when they plan carefully, when they respect the challenges they face, and when they're willing to put in the hard, unglamorous work that makes spectacular achievements possible. The summit of Everest is spectacular, a moment of triumph and joy. But the camps, the carries, the route finding, the logistics, that's the real story of how the summit was reached. As the sun rose on May 29, 1953, illuminating the highest peaks of the Himalayas with golden light, two men were climbing toward a goal that had been pursued for over 3 decades. They climbed slowly, methodically, conserving their energy and their limited oxygen supply. They climbed past the south summit, where Bourdelon and Evans had turned back 2 days earlier. They climbed along the narrow, exposed ridge toward the final obstacle, the Hillary Step. And behind them, below them, supporting them even though they were no longer visible, was the chain of camps that made this moment possible. Camp 7 on the southeast ridge, Camp 6 on the South Col, Camp 5 on the Geneva Spur, Camp 4 on the upper Lot's Face, Camp 3 on the lower Lot's Face, Camp 2 in the western Khumbu, Camp 1 above the Khumbu Icefall, and Base Camp on the Khumbu Glacier. Each camp was a link in the chain, each one essential, each one representing human determination and effort in one of the harshest environments on Earth. The camps on Everest in 1953 were not comfortable. They were not safe. They were not places anyone would choose to be if they had an alternative. But they were necessary, and they worked. They allowed climbers to ascend gradually, to acclimatize, to rest and recover before pushing higher. They allowed supplies to be staged for the summit attempt. They provided routes of retreat if things went wrong. They were the infrastructure that turned an impossible dream into an achievable goal. And on that morning of May 29th, as Hillary and Tenzing climbed toward the summit, all that planning, all that effort, all those camps and carries and fixed ropes and oxygen bottles, it all came down to this: 2 men, moving slowly upward, 1 step at a time, getting closer to the top of the world with each labored breath. The camps had done their job. The team had done its job. Now it was up to Hillary and Tenzing to take the final steps. The morning of May 29, 1953, dawned clear and cold at Camp 8, the highest camp ever established on Mount Everest. Edmund, Hillary and Tenzing Norgay had spent a restless night at 8,500 meters, 27,900 feet, in the death zone where the human body slowly consumes itself in the thin air. They had dozed fitfully in their small tent, their oxygen regulators hissing quietly, conserving precious gas while they tried to rest. Now, as the first hints of light appeared in the eastern sky, it was time to begin the most important climb of their lives. Hillary woke first, or perhaps he had never truly been asleep. The cold was intense, probably around -30 degrees Celsius, and his boots, which he'd brought into his sleeping bag to keep from freezing solid, were still stiff with cold. Outside the tent, the wind was surprisingly light, a good sign. Strong winds would make a summit attempt impossible, turning the exposed ridges above them into death traps. But this morning, the mountain seemed to be offering them a chance. Tenzing was already stirring, preparing the small stove they'd used to melt snow for water. At this altitude, even simple tasks require enormous effort. Lighting a stove, melting snow, preparing food, all of it takes time and energy that climbers can barely spare. But hydration was critical, and both men forced themselves to drink cup after cup of warm liquid, knowing that dehydration could impair their judgment and sap their strength. Breakfast was minimal. Neither man had much appetite at this altitude, but they knew they needed fuel for the climb ahead. They ate a few biscuits, some sardines, dates, and jam, washing it down with more hot drinks. Then came the laborious process of getting dressed for the climb. Multiple layers of wool clothing, windproof outer suits, heavy boots, thick gloves, goggles, and finally, the oxygen equipment. The oxygen sets they carried were primitive by modern standards but represented the best technology available in 1953. Each set consisted of heavy steel oxygen bottles, a regulator to control the flow of gas, rubber tubes, and a face mask. The entire apparatus weighed about 30 pounds, a tremendous burden to carry at extreme altitude. But without supplemental oxygen, reaching the summit would be virtually impossible. Even with oxygen, they would be functioning with only a fraction of their normal capacity, every movement slow and deliberate, every decision requiring conscious effort. Hillary checked his oxygen equipment carefully, adjusting the flow rate and making sure there were no leaks in the system. A malfunction at this altitude could be fatal. Tenzing did the same, both men working methodically through their pre-climb checks. They had 3 oxygen bottles each, which would give them about 7 hours of climbing time at the flow rate they'd chosen. 7 hours to climb to the summit and get back to Camp 8. It would be tight, but it should be enough if everything went according to plan. As the light grew stronger, Hillary unzipped the tent and looked out at the mountain above them. The southeast ridge stretched upward, a narrow spine of snow and rock leading toward the south summit, visible as a white hump against the deep blue of the high-altitude sky. Beyond the south summit, hidden from view, was the final ridge leading to the true summit of Everest. That was their goal, less than 350 vertical meters above them but separated by some of the most difficult terrain on the planet. At about 6:30 in the morning, Hillary and Tenzing left Camp 8 and began climbing. The route led up steep snow slopes on the southeast ridge, following the track that Bourdillon and Evans had broken 2 days earlier. This was a tremendous advantage. Breaking trail through deep snow at this altitude is exhausting work, and the fact that someone had already done it meant Hillary and Tenzing could conserve energy and move more quickly. The climbing was still desperately hard. Each step required multiple breaths, and they moved in a rhythm that became automatic: step, breathe, 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 step, breathe, breathe, breathe. The slope was steep enough that they needed to use their ice axes for balance, digging the points into the snow and pulling themselves upward. The exposure was extreme, with the Kangsheng face dropping away thousands of meters to their right and the southwest face falling away to their left. One slip, one mistake, and there would be no recovery. But both men were experienced, careful climbers. They moved steadily, conserving energy, focusing on the next step rather than thinking about how far they still had to go. The oxygen helped, giving them just enough additional capacity to keep moving, but they were still operating at the very edge of human endurance. At this altitude, the partial pressure of oxygen is so low that even with supplemental gas, climbers are functioning with about the same oxygen availability as sea-level residents breathing normal air. And they're doing it while climbing a steep mountain, carrying heavy loads, and dealing with extreme cold. After about 2 hours of climbing, Hillary and Tenzing reached the south summit at approximately 8,750 meters or 28,700 feet. This was the highest point that Bourdillon and Evans had reached, and for a moment, Hillary and Tenzing stood there, looking at the route ahead. From the south summit, they could now see the final ridge leading to the true summit, and what they saw was both encouraging and intimidating. The ridge was narrow, knife-edged in places, with enormous cornices of overhanging snow projecting out over the Kangsheng face. These cornices were beautiful but deadly. They were formed by wind depositing snow on the leeward side of the ridge, creating structures that projected out into space, supported by nothing but the cohesion of the snow crystals. Step on a cornice, and it could break off, sending the climber plummeting down the Kangsheng face. Hillary and Tenzing would need to stay well away from the cornices, climbing on the rocky western side of the ridge whenever possible. About halfway along the ridge between the south summit and the true summit, Hillary could see what would become known as the Hillary Step, a rock face about 40 feet high, almost vertical, directly in their path. There was no way around it. They would have to climb it, and they would have to do it at nearly 8,800 meters, higher than any technical rock climbing had ever been attempted before. But first, they had to traverse along the ridge to reach the step. They moved carefully, testing every step, aware that the snow beneath their feet might be a cornice projecting out over the abyss. The climbing was technical and exposed, requiring concentration and skill. At one point, they encountered a section where the ridge narrowed to just a few feet wide, with steep drops on both sides. Hillary later described it as one of the most dangerous sections of the entire route. As they approached the Hillary Step, both climbers could see the difficulty ahead. The step was a vertical or near-vertical rock face, about 12 meters high, composed of dark rock and patches of snow. At sea level, it would be a straightforward climb, probably rated about Class 4 or Easy Class 5 in climbing terms. But at 8,790 meters, with limited oxygen, wearing bulky clothing and boots, and carrying oxygen equipment, it became a formidable obstacle. Hillary studied the step, looking for the best route. On the right side of the step, a large cornice of snow had built up against the rock, creating a narrow crack or chimney between the rock face and the cornice. This crack looked like it might offer a way up, though it would require an unusual technique. Hillary would need to wedge himself into the crack, press his back against one side and his feet against the other, and then literally inch himself upward, a technique climbers call chimneying. This was a critical moment. If Hillary couldn't climb the step, the summit would remain out of reach. If he fell while attempting it, he could be seriously injured or killed, and Tenzing, belaying him from below, might not be able to hold the fall at this altitude. But turning back without attempting it was unthinkable. They had come too far, worked too hard, and the summit was so close. Hillary began climbing the step. He jammed himself into the crack between the rock and the cornice, his oxygen equipment and clothing making the tight space even more constricted. Using his crampons against the rock and his back against the snow, he began working his way upward. It was strenuous, technical climbing at an altitude where most people can barely stand. Every move had to be calculated, every placement of hands and feet deliberate. The oxygen mask made it difficult to see clearly, and the bulk of the equipment restricted his movement. But Hillary was a skilled, experienced climber, and he was determined. Inch by inch, he worked his way up the step, fighting for every bit of progress. It probably took him only about 10 minutes to climb the 40-foot face, but it must have felt much longer. When he finally pulled himself over the top of the step and onto the ridge above, it was a moment of triumph and relief. The hardest obstacle was behind them. Tenzing followed, and Hillary belayed him from above, managing the rope to provide security. Tenzing was also an accomplished climber, and he made his way up the step successfully, using the same crack that Hillary had pioneered. When both men stood above the Hillary Step, they knew that the summit was within reach. There were no more technical obstacles, just a long, steep snow slope leading to the top. They continued climbing, moving steadily upward along the ridge. The slope eased slightly, but the altitude was more debilitating than ever. They were now above 8,800 meters, in the highest reaches of the death zone. Every step was an effort of will. Their muscles screamed for oxygen that their blood couldn't provide. Their hearts pounded, trying to circulate what little oxygen was available. Their breathing was labored, ragged, desperate. But they kept moving. Step after step, breath after breath, meter after meter. The summit ridge stretched ahead, curving gently upward. And then, gradually, Hillary noticed that the ridge ahead was no longer rising. It was beginning to descend on the far side. They were approaching the highest point. At approximately 11:30 in the morning on May 29, 1953, Edmund Hillary took a few more steps and realized there was nowhere higher to go. He was standing on the summit of Mount Everest, the highest point on Earth, 8,848 meters or 29,029 feet above sea level. A few steps behind him, Tenzing Norgay arrived at the summit, and the two men stood together on the small, snow-covered platform at the top of the world. The feeling must have been overwhelming, a mixture of triumph, exhaustion, disbelief, and joy. They had done what no one had done before. They had reached the summit of Everest, the mountain that had turned back every previous attempt, the mountain that many had believed was beyond human capability. And they had done it together, a New Zealander and a Sherpa representing the partnership that had made the expedition successful. There was no time for a long celebration. They were in the death zone, and every minute spent at this altitude was dangerous. But they took a few precious minutes to mark their achievement and gather evidence of their success. Hillary took photographs, capturing images of Tenzing standing on the summit, holding aloft his ice axe with flags of the United Nations, Great Britain, Nepal, and India attached to it. These photographs would become iconic, proof of their achievement and a symbol of human determination. Hillary also photographed the view from the summit, a 360-degree panorama of the Himalayas stretching away in every direction. To the north, they could see into Tibet, the Great Plateau stretching toward the horizon. To the south, they could see the valleys of Nepal, the Khumbu region far below, and in the distance, the foothills of the Himalayas giving way to the plains of India. To the east and west, they could see other peaks of the Himalayan range, including Lhotse, Makalu, Cho Oyu, and Kangchenjunga, all of them giants in their own right but all below them now. Tenzing, following Buddhist tradition, made a small offering to the gods of the mountain, digging a hole in the snow and placing some sweets, biscuits, and a small crucifix that had been given to him by a friend. This was an important spiritual moment for Tenzing, a recognition that the mountains were sacred and that reaching the summit was not just a physical achievement but a blessing from the gods who dwelled on the peaks. Hillary checked their oxygen supply and realized they couldn't linger. They had been on the summit for about 15 minutes, and their oxygen bottles were running low. The descent was going to be dangerous and exhausting, and they needed to conserve enough oxygen to get safely back to Camp 8 and ideally down to the South Col. With a final look around at the incredible vista, Hillary and Tenzing began their descent. Going down was in some ways more difficult than going up. The climbers were exhausted, their judgment was impaired by altitude and fatigue, and the technical difficulties hadn't gone away just because they'd reached the summit. They had to reverse the route, climbing back over the Hillary Step, traversing the exposed ridge to the south summit, and then descending the long snow slopes to Camp 8. The descent of the Hillary Step was particularly nerve-wracking. Climbing down a vertical face is often harder than climbing up, and doing it at nearly 8,800 meters, with failing oxygen and exhausted muscles, required extreme care. Hillary went first, belayed by Tenzing, lowering himself down the crack between the rock and the cornice. Then Tenzing descended, moving carefully, aware that a slip could send him tumbling down the mountain. By early afternoon, Hillary and Tenzing reached Camp 8. They had been climbing for about 7 hours, and they were completely spent. But they couldn't stop yet. Camp 8 was too high, too dangerous, too inhospitable. They needed to descend further, at least to the South Col, preferably lower if they could manage it. After a brief rest and some water melted from snow, they packed up the tent and the essential gear and began descending toward the South Col. The descent from Camp 8 to the South Col was a blur of exhaustion and determination. They followed the fixed ropes down the southeast ridge, moving mechanically, one foot in front of the other. Their oxygen was completely exhausted by this point, and they were climbing on willpower alone. The descent required just as much concentration as the ascent, perhaps more, because fatigue made it easy to make mistakes. A slip, a missed foothold, a momentary lapse in concentration, any of these could be fatal. The southeast ridge seemed endless on the descent. Every step downward jarred already exhausted legs. The exposure remained terrifying, with 1,000-meter drops on either side of the narrow ridge. Hillary and Tenzing moved carefully, checking each placement of their feet, testing the snow before committing their weight. The cornices that had threatened them on the way up remained dangerous on the descent, and they stayed well away from the edge of the ridge. When they finally reached the South Col and saw the tents of Camp 6, it was an enormous relief. They were greeted by George Lowe and other expedition members who had been anxiously waiting for news. Lowe and the others had spent an agonizing day watching the ridge above through telescopes, trying to spot the tiny figures of Hillary and Tenzing, hoping for success but prepared for the possibility of tragedy. When they saw two figures descending in the late afternoon, they knew immediately that the summit must have been reached. Climbers who failed on Everest tended to descend quickly, eager to escape the mountain. But Hillary and Tenzing's steady, methodical descent suggested success. Lowe saw them approaching and immediately asked the question that everyone wanted answered: how did it go? Hillary's response has become legendary. He simply said, "Well, George, we knocked the bastard off." It was a characteristically understated way to announce one of the greatest achievements in the history of exploration, but it conveyed everything that needed to be said. They had reached the summit. Everest had been climbed. The news spread quickly through the camps. Lowe and the others at the South Col were jubilant, congratulating Hillary and Tenzing, taking photographs, and preparing to help them descend further. But Hillary and Tenzing were far too exhausted to celebrate properly. They needed rest, food, water, and most of all, they needed to get to a lower altitude where their bodies could begin to recover. The next morning, May 30th, Hillary and Tenzing, along with Lowe and the others from the South Col, began the long descent to lower camps. The relief of moving to lower altitudes was immediate and profound. With each 100 meters of descent, the air became thicker, oxygen more plentiful, breathing easier. The crushing headache that had plagued Hillary at the South Col began to ease. Tenzing felt strength returning to his legs. It was like coming back to life after days of slow suffocation. They retraced the route down the Geneva Spur to Camp 4 on the Lot's Face. The fixed ropes that had been so difficult to climb up weeks earlier now provided security as they descended. The Lot's Face, which had seemed impossibly steep and exposed on the ascent, was still challenging on the descent, but the knowledge that they had succeeded, that the mountain had been climbed, made every difficulty seem more bearable. From Camp 4, they descended the fixed ropes to Camp 3, and then continued down to Camp 2 in the Western Khum. The Western Khum, which had been a furnace of reflected heat during the day on the way up, was now a welcome corridor leading them away from the extreme altitudes above. The massive walls of Everest and nups that towered on either side no longer seemed quite so menacing. They had climbed higher than those walls, they had stood on the summit, and now they were coming home. At Camp 2, they were greeted by more expedition members, including John Hunt, who had been anxiously awaiting news from above. Hunt emerged from his tent as Hillary and Tenzing approached, and the expression on his face was a mixture of hope and anxiety. He had devoted months of his life to planning and leading this expedition, and the success or failure of everything he'd worked for depended on what Hillary was about to tell him. Hillary's broad grin told Hunt everything before any words were spoken. They had done it. They had reached the summit. Hunt's reaction was one of pure joy and relief. He embraced both climbers, congratulating them, asking about details, making sure they were safe and healthy. There was a celebration of sorts at Camp 2, though everyone was still too tired for much revelry. Hot drinks were prepared, food was shared, and stories were told about the summit day. Hillary and Tenzing described the Hillary Step, the final ridge, the moment of reaching the summit, and the incredible views from the top of the world. But even in this moment of triumph, Hunt was thinking ahead. He knew that the expedition's success needed to be communicated to the world as quickly as possible. Other expeditions, including teams from Switzerland and France, were planning Everest attempts for future seasons. Hunt wanted to ensure that Britain received credit for the first ascent, and that meant getting the news back to London before any rumors or competing claims could complicate the story. The descent continued the following day, May 31st. The team made their way down through the western Khumbu toward the Khumbu Icefall. The Khumbu, which had been such a challenging and dangerous section on the way up, now seemed almost routine. They knew the route, they knew where the crevasses were hidden, they knew which sections required careful attention and which could be traversed more quickly. The familiarity bred not contempt but confidence. They moved efficiently, conserving energy for the final challenge of the icefall. The Khumbu Icefall, which had claimed so much of their attention and anxiety during the establishment of the lower camps, remained dangerous on the descent. If anything, descending through the icefall was more difficult than climbing up through it. Going downward meant facing away from obstacles, unable to see where you were placing your feet, having to trust the fixed ropes and the aluminium ladders that spanned the crevasses. The seracs that towered over the route seemed even more unstable, groaning and cracking in the midday heat. But now, with the summit reached and the expedition's primary goal accomplished, the icefall seemed less frightening. The same obstacles were there, the same crevasses had to be crossed, the same unstable ice towers loomed overhead, but the psychological burden was different. On the way up, failure in the icefall meant the end of dreams, the end of the expedition. On the way down, having already succeeded, the icefall was just one more obstacle to overcome before reaching the safety of base camp. Hillary and Tenzing navigated the icefall carefully, treating it with the respect it demanded, but moving with the confidence of experienced climbers who had seen worse. The ladders that had seemed so precarious weeks earlier were now familiar, almost routine. The crevasses that had yawned like mouths of darkness were now just obstacles to be crossed. And when they finally emerged from the bottom of the icefall and saw base camp spread out on the glacier below them, the relief and joy were overwhelming. The entire expedition was there to greet them at base camp. Sherpas and climbers alike had been waiting for this moment, and when Hillary and Tenzing appeared, descending the final slopes from the icefall, there was genuine celebration. Sherpas danced and sang traditional songs, their voices rising in celebration of Tenzing's achievement. The Western climbers shook hands and embraced, congratulating each other on a job well done. There was laughter, there were tears, there was a sense of shared accomplishment that transcended national boundaries and cultural differences. The celebration at base camp was spontaneous and heartfelt. There was no formal ceremony, no speeches, just people who had worked together for weeks, sharing a moment of pure joy. Food was prepared, the expedition's small supply of celebratory alcohol was broken out, and stories were shared around the mess tent. Hillary and Tenzing were the heroes of the hour, but everyone recognized that the achievement belonged to the entire team. Every person who had carried a load, fixed a rope, cooked a meal, or supported the effort in any way could claim a share in the success. Tenzing was particularly moved by the celebration. For years, he had worked on Everest expeditions in support roles, helping Western climbers pursue their dreams of the summit. Now, he had reached the summit himself, and he was being celebrated not as a porter or a Sherpa employee but as a climber, an equal partner in a great achievement. The Sherpa team was enormously proud, seeing one of their own standing on the summit of Chomolungma, the mother goddess of the world, as they called Everest in their language. Hunt, meanwhile, was already thinking about logistics. The celebration would continue, but there was work to be done. Base camp needed to be dismantled, equipment packed up, supplies inventoried. More importantly, the news of the summit needed to reach London as quickly as possible. Hunt had prepared coded messages in advance, with different codes to indicate different outcomes: success, failure, who reached the summit, any casualties. Now he composed the message announcing success, using the pre-arranged code to compress the information into a brief dispatch that could be transmitted by telegram. The expedition had arranged for a runner to carry messages from base camp to the nearest telegraph station, which was in Namche Bazaar, several days' journey away. This runner would then have to continue to Kathmandu, where the message could be telegraphed to London. The whole process would take about a week, perhaps longer if there were delays. In our modern world of instant communication, it's hard to imagine waiting a week for news to travel from one place to another, but in 1953, in the remote Himalayas, there was no faster way. Hunt gave the coded message to a reliable Sherpa runner who set off immediately from base camp. The message was brief and cryptic, designed to be unintelligible to anyone who might intercept it, but perfectly clear to its intended recipients in London. The coded message indicated that the summit had been reached on May 29 by Hillary and Tenzing, that both climbers were safe, and that the expedition was descending successfully. With the runner dispatched, Hunt could turn his attention to the next phase, getting the entire expedition back to Kathmandu. Meanwhile, the expedition began the process of packing up base camp and preparing for the long trek back to Kathmandu. Base camp, which had been home for over 2 months, was systematically dismantled. Tents were taken down and packed, equipment was sorted and organized, food supplies that hadn't been used were distributed to local Sherpa communities or prepared for transport back to Kathmandu. The process took several days, and during that time, there was a chance for the team to rest, recover, and reflect on what they had accomplished. The physical changes in the climbers were striking. Every person had lost significant weight during the expedition. The combination of hard physical work, high altitude, and limited appetite had stripped away fat and even muscle tissue. Hillary had lost about 20 pounds from his already lean frame. Tenzing had lost a similar amount. Some of the other climbers who had spent extensive time at high altitude had lost even more. Their faces were gaunt, their clothing hung loosely, and they showed the physical toll that Everest extracts from those who climb it. But despite the physical exhaustion and weight loss, spirits were high. There was a sense of satisfaction and accomplishment that made every hardship seem worthwhile. The climbers spent their time at base camp sharing stories, reviewing photographs, and planning what they would say when they returned to civilization. Hillary and Tenzing, in particular, began to understand that their lives were about to change dramatically. They would return to the world as heroes, celebrities, famous beyond anything they had previously experienced. For Hillary, who was naturally modest and somewhat uncomfortable with attention, the prospect of fame was daunting. He was a beekeeper from New Zealand, a practical man who enjoyed the mountains but didn't seek glory. Now he was going to be a national hero, possibly a global celebrity. It was more than he had bargained for when he signed up for the expedition. For Tenzing, the situation was even more complex. As a Sherpa, he had grown up in a culture that valued humility and community over individual achievement. The attention he was about to receive was contrary to his upbringing and instincts. Moreover, Tenzing understood that he would be caught between different constituencies, each wanting to claim him as their own. Nepal would want to celebrate him as a Nepalese hero, India would claim him as an Indian citizen since he lived in Darjeeling, and Tibet would note that he had Tibetan heritage. The politics of his identity would become complicated in ways that Hillary would never have to deal with. The trek back to Kathmandu began in early June, after base camp was fully dismantled and everything was packed for transport. The expedition retraced its steps down the Khumbu Valley, passing through Sherpa villages where they had stopped on the way in. But now the reception was very different. Word of the summit's success had spread quickly through the valley, carried by Sherpa porters and traders. In every village, the expedition was greeted with celebrations, with Sherpas offering congratulations and blessings, with local chang, the traditional Tibetan beer, being shared in honor of the achievement. The expedition stopped at Tengboche Monastery, where the monks held a special ceremony of thanksgiving. The head lama blessed the climbers and expressed particular pride in Tenzing's achievement. For the Buddhist Sherpas, Everest is not just a mountain but a sacred place, the throne of the gods. The fact that Tenzing had reached the summit and returned safely was seen as a sign of divine favor, proof that the expedition had shown proper respect to the mountain and its spiritual significance. The trek took about 2 weeks, the same amount of time as the approach march, but the journey felt very different. On the way in, they had been tense, focused on the challenge ahead, uncertain whether they would succeed. On the way out, they were relaxed, celebratory, able to enjoy the spectacular scenery and the warmth of the Nepali people's hospitality. They took time to appreciate details they had rushed past on the approach: the rhododendron forests in full bloom, the terraced fields where farmers worked, the prayer flags fluttering in the wind, the children who ran out from villages to see the famous climbers. As they descended from the high country into the warmer, thicker air of the lower valleys, the physical recovery continued. Appetites returned with a vengeance, and the climbers ate enormous meals at every opportunity, their bodies crying out for the calories needed to rebuild wasted muscle and tissue. The warmth of the lower elevations was a luxury after months of cold, and the simple pleasure of not having to wear multiple layers of clothing was something to savor. The expedition reached Kathmandu in mid-June, entering the city to an official welcome from the Nepalese government. King Tribhuvan received them at the royal palace, congratulating them on their achievement and thanking them for putting Nepal on the map as the country that hosted the successful Everest expedition. The king was particularly gracious to Tenzing, recognizing him as a son of Nepal who had brought honor to the country. It was a diplomatic gesture with political implications, as Nepal wanted to establish its claim to both Everest and Tenzing in the face of competing claims from other nations. The expedition spent several days in Kathmandu, resting, giving press interviews, and preparing for the journey back to their respective homes. It was during this time that they learned that Hunt's coded message had reached London and that the news of their success had been announced on June 2nd, coinciding perfectly with the coronation of Queen Elizabeth II. The timing could not have been better from a publicity standpoint. Britain was celebrating the coronation of a young queen, looking forward to a new Elizabethan age, and the news from Everest seemed to confirm that British determination and ingenuity could still achieve great things. The British newspapers had gone wild with the story. Front-page headlines proclaimed the conquest of Everest, with photographs of the expedition members, maps of the route, and detailed accounts of the climb. Hillary and Tenzing were being hailed as heroes, and the entire expedition was praised for its organization and success. The Times of London, which had exclusive rights to the expedition story, published extensive coverage that sold out multiple print runs. The mood in Britain was jubilant, a rare moment of celebration in a country still recovering from the war years. For Hunt, Hillary, and Tenzing, the news from London meant that the full weight of their achievement was beginning to settle on them. They were no longer just climbers who had succeeded on a difficult mountain. They were national heroes, symbols of British and Commonwealth success, celebrities whose lives would never be quite the same again. The expedition made plans to return to London for official celebrations, while the Sherpa team members prepared to return to their villages in the Khumbu, carrying their wages and bonuses, and their own pride in having been part of a historic achievement. The journey back to Britain was long, involving flights and ship travel, but everywhere the expedition went, they were greeted with enthusiasm and congratulations. When they finally arrived in London in late June, they were met with a reception that exceeded anything they had imagined. There were crowds at the airport, reporters shouting questions, flashbulbs popping, and a sense of excitement and celebration that seemed to grip the entire nation. The political and cultural context of the time amplified the significance of the Everest climb. Britain in 1953 was still recovering from World War II, rationing was only recently ended, and the British Empire was in decline as colonies gained independence. The coronation of a young queen offered hope for a new beginning, and the Everest success seemed to symbolize British determination and capability. It was a rare moment of national pride and celebration in a period otherwise marked by austerity and adjustment. For New Zealand, Hillary's achievement was a source of immense pride. A relatively small nation on the far side of the world had produced a man who stood on top of the world. Hillary became a national hero, though he remained remarkably modest and down-to-earth about his achievement. When asked how it felt to be the first person to stand on the summit of Everest, Hillary characteristically deferred some of the credit, noting that he and Tenzing had reached the summit together, as a team. For Tenzing Norgay, the achievement was more complex. As a Sherpa, he had been part of many expeditions, often in support roles, and he had never received the recognition given to Western climbers. Now he was world famous, but he also faced questions about who had reached the summit first, him or Hillary, as if that mattered. There was also some controversy about his nationality. Tenzing had been born in the Khumbu region, which was in Nepal, but he had spent much of his life in Darjeeling, India, and both countries wanted to claim him as their own. Tenzing handled these issues with grace and dignity. He consistently stated that he and Hillary had reached the summit together, as partners, and that the question of who stepped on top first was meaningless. They were a team, and they had succeeded together. This generous spirit earned Tenzing even more respect, and he became not just a mountaineering hero but a symbol of Sherpa capability and the partnership between Sherpas and Western climbers. The British expedition members returned to England as heroes. There was a ticker-tape parade, meetings with the Queen, and numerous honours. Hillary and Hunt were both knighted, becoming Sir Edmund Hillary and Sir John Hunt. Tenzing, as a citizen of India or Nepal depending on how you defined it, was not eligible for a British knighthood, but he was awarded the George Medal, a high British honour for gallantry. This disparity in honours caused some controversy, with many feeling that Tenzing deserved equal recognition to Hillary. But the politics of the time were complex, and the honours reflected the realities of colonial relationships and national identities. In the years following the expedition, all three men, Hillary, Tenzing, and Hunt, used their fame to do good work. Hillary devoted much of his life to helping the Sherpa people, building schools, hospitals, and infrastructure in the Khumbu region. He established the Himalayan Trust, which continues to support education and healthcare in Nepal. Hillary's commitment to the Sherpa people was genuine and lifelong, and he remained close friends with Tenzing until Tenzing's death in 1986. Tenzing became the director of field training for the Himalayan Mountaineering Institute in Darjeeling, where he trained generations of climbers and helped establish mountaineering as a respected profession in India and Nepal. He traveled the world, giving lectures and accepting honors, but he never forgot his roots in the Khumbu, and he remained a humble, gracious ambassador for the Sherpa people. John Hunt continued his military career, rising to the rank of brigadier, and later became involved in youth development and outdoor education. He was a strong advocate for the Duke of Edinburgh's award program and worked to make outdoor experiences available to young people from all backgrounds. Hunt remained involved in mountaineering and exploration throughout his life, serving as president of the Alpine Club and other organizations. The success of the 1953 Everest expedition had a profound impact on mountaineering. It proved that Everest could be climbed, and it established the template for future expeditions. The camp system, the use of supplemental oxygen, the partnership between Western climbers and Sherpas, the careful logistics and planning, all of these became standard practices for high-altitude mountaineering. In the decades following 1953, many other climbers reached the summit of Everest, using the same basic approach that Hillary, Tenzing, and the 1953 expedition had pioneered. But the 1953 expedition also highlighted the costs and risks of high-altitude mountaineering. The Khumbu Icefall remained deadly, claiming lives in almost every climbing season. The death zone above 8,000 meters remained a place where human life could not be sustained, and many climbers who reached the summit did not survive the descent. The mountain demanded respect, and those who underestimated it paid a terrible price. Over the decades, Everest became increasingly commercialized. By the 1990s, guided expeditions were offering wealthy clients the chance to climb Everest for a substantial fee. This commercialization brought both benefits and problems. On the one hand, more people had the opportunity to attempt Everest, and the Sherpa communities benefited economically from the climbing industry. On the other hand, the mountain became crowded, with hundreds of climbers attempting the summit each season, leading to traffic jams on the mountain, environmental degradation, and a sense that the adventure and challenge of climbing Everest had been diminished. The environmental impact of decades of climbing became increasingly apparent. The South Col, the Western Khumbu, and base camp became littered with discarded oxygen bottles, tents, food wrappers, and other trash. The Khumbu Icefall was festooned with fixed ropes and ladders that accumulated over years. And the tragedy of climbers who died on the mountain and whose bodies remained in place became a grim reminder of the mountain's dangers. In recent years, there have been efforts to clean up Everest, with expeditions dedicated to removing trash and even attempting to bring down bodies, but the task is enormous and ongoing. Climate change has also affected Everest. Glaciers in the Himalayas are retreating, altering the landscape that Hillary and Tenzing climbed through. The Khumbu Icefall has changed, with new crevasses and different serac formations. Some routes that were passable in 1953 are no longer viable, and new routes have had to be found. Scientists studying climate change point to the Himalayas as one of the regions most affected by warming temperatures, with implications not just for mountaineering but for the millions of people who depend on Himalayan glacier for their water supply. Despite these challenges and changes, Everest remains the ultimate mountaineering challenge for many climbers. Standing on the summit of Everest is still a rare achievement, still requires immense physical and mental strength, and still carries significant risk. The mountain has not become easier or safer just because more people have climbed it. If anything, the crowds and commercialization have introduced new dangers, as inexperienced climbers pushed beyond their abilities by ambitious guides can endanger themselves and others. The legacy of the 1953 expedition extends beyond mountaineering. It's a story about what humans can achieve when they work together, plan carefully, and remain determined in the face of enormous challenges. It's a story about partnership across cultures, with Western climbers and Sherpas working side by side toward a common goal. It's a story about leadership, with John Hunt making difficult decisions and putting the success of the expedition ahead of his own ambitions. And it's a story about two men, Hillary and Tenzing, who stood together on the highest point on Earth and shared that moment of triumph equally. The camps that were established on Everest in 1953, from Base Camp to Camp 8, were more than just temporary shelters. They were statements of human intention and capability. Each camp represented a victory over the mountain, a foothold gained through hard work and determination. Each camp was a link in a chain that stretched from the relative safety of base camp to the extreme danger of the summit. And each camp was essential to the final success. The story of those camps, of the carries and the route finding, of the Sherpas and climbers working together, of the supplies accumulated and the obstacles overcome, that story is just as important as the story of the summit day. The summit was the culmination, the moment of triumph, but it was built on weeks of unglamorous, exhausting work by dozens of people. The camps were the foundation of success, and without them, there would have been no summit. The Sherpa contribution to the expedition's success cannot be overstated. While Hillary and Tenzing received the glory of the summit, and rightly so, the expedition would have been impossible without the Sherpa team. Men like Ang Nima, who carried loads to Camp 8, supporting Hillary and Tenzing's summit bid, D.A. Namgyal, who climbed with Hunt to over 8,300 meters to establish a supply cache, and Ulu, who was the first to reach the South Col alongside Wilfred Noyce. These men and many others performed feats of strength and endurance that were every bit as impressive as the summit climb itself. The Sherpa porters carried loads that would have crushed most Western climbers. While the Western expedition members typically carried 15 to 20 kilograms on their high-altitude carries, many Sherpas routinely carried 25 to 30 kilograms, sometimes more. They made more carries than the Western climbers, working day after day with less rest and less recognition. The Sherpa climbing team lived and worked at high altitude with remarkable efficiency, suffering less from altitude sickness than their Western counterparts, recovering more quickly from extreme exertion, and maintaining their strength and enthusiasm throughout the expedition. This superior high-altitude performance is not just a matter of experience, though experience certainly plays a role. Sherpas have genetic adaptations that help them function better in low-oxygen environments. Scientific studies conducted in later years have identified several physiological differences. Sherpas have higher concentrations of hemoglobin in their blood, allowing them to carry more oxygen to their tissues. They have more efficient oxygen utilization at the cellular level, with mitochondria that function better in hypoxic conditions. Their blood vessels dilate more readily, improving circulation. And they seem to suffer less from the accumulation of lactic acid during intense exertion at altitude. These adaptations are the result of thousands of years of evolution at high altitude. The Sherpa people migrated from Tibet to the Khumbu region of Nepal centuries ago, settling in valleys at elevations of 3,000 to 4,000 meters. For generations, they lived, worked, and raised families at altitudes that would incapacitate most lowlanders. Over time, natural selection favored individuals who could function well in these conditions, gradually creating a population with remarkable high-altitude capabilities. But the Sherpa contribution to mountaineering goes beyond just physical adaptations. Sherpas brought cultural knowledge, mountain skills, and a deep respect for the Himalayas that enriched every expedition they joined. They understood weather patterns, knew where to find water sources, could predict avalanche danger from subtle signs in the snow, and could navigate through difficult terrain with an instinct born of lifelong experience in the mountains. They brought Buddhist spiritual practices that helped them maintain mental equilibrium in stressful situations, approaching dangerous climbs with a calm acceptance that Western climbers often found remarkable. The relationship between Western climbers and Sherpas in 1953 was complex, reflecting both genuine partnership and the colonial attitudes of the time. On the one hand, climbers like Hillary genuinely respected the Sherpas and recognized them as essential partners. Hillary's lifelong commitment to helping Sherpa communities after 1953 demonstrated real respect and gratitude. Hunt explicitly included Tenzing in the summit team as a full climbing member, not just a porter, which was a significant gesture. On the other hand, the expedition reflected the hierarchies of its time. Western climbers and Sherpas ate separately, slept in different tents, and were paid very different wages. The British climbers were there to climb, while most Sherpas were there to work, carrying loads to support the British climbers' ambitions. When the expedition ended, Hillary and Hunt were knighted, while Tenzing received a lesser honor. The press coverage focused overwhelmingly on the British achievement, with less attention paid to the Sherpa contribution. These inequities were not lost on Tenzing or the other Sherpas, but they handled them with remarkable grace. Tenzing consistently spoke positively about the British climbers, emphasizing the teamwork and partnership. He refused to be drawn into debates about whether he or Hillary had stepped on the summit first, insisting that they had reached it together and that the question was meaningless. This generosity of spirit, combined with his genuine achievement, made Tenzing a beloved figure and helped advance the recognition of Sherpas as climbers in their own right rather than just porters. The 1953 expedition marked a turning point in how Sherpas were viewed in the mountaineering world. Previous expeditions had used Sherpas primarily as load carriers, with rare exceptions like Tenzing on the 1952 Swiss expedition. After 1953, with Tenzing's summit success widely celebrated, it became increasingly common for Sherpas to be included in summit teams on major expeditions. Today, most Everest summit teams include Sherpas as full climbing members, and some of the most impressive mountaineering achievements in history have been made by Sherpa climbers. The camps established in 1953 also set a template for future expeditions. The basic route, from base camp through the Khumbu Icefall to the western Khumbu, up the Lot's face to the South Col, and then along the southeast ridge to the summit, became the standard route for climbing Everest from Nepal. The camp locations identified in 1953, with only minor variations, are still used today. Modern expeditions typically establish four main camps, combining what were separate camps in 1953, but the fundamental progression up the mountain remains the same. The techniques pioneered in 1953, particularly the use of fixed ropes on difficult sections and the systematic stocking of high camps with oxygen and supplies, also became standard practice. Modern expeditions are far more comfortable and supported than the 1953 expedition, with better equipment, more sophisticated weather forecasting, and even helicopter support in some cases. But the basic principle remains the same. You establish camps at progressively higher elevations, you stock those camps with supplies carried up from below, you acclimatize gradually by moving up and down the mountain, and you make your summit bid from a high camp when conditions are favorable. The oxygen equipment used in 1953 was revolutionary for its time, though primitive by modern standards. The expedition tested both closed-circuit and open-circuit systems, ultimately relying on the open-circuit system for the successful summit bid. Modern oxygen systems are much lighter, more reliable, and easier to use, but the fundamental principle is the same. Supplemental oxygen makes it possible to function at extreme altitudes where humans could not otherwise survive for extended periods. The 1953 expedition also demonstrated the importance of rigorous planning and logistics in high-altitude mountaineering. Hunt's meticulous organization, his careful tracking of supplies and personnel, his systematic rotation of climbers to ensure proper acclimatization, all of these factors contributed to success. Modern expeditions, whether commercial or private, still rely on the same kind of careful planning. The margins for error at extreme altitude are so small that details matter enormously, and expeditions that cut corners or ignore logistics often end in tragedy. When we think about great achievements, we often focus on the final moment, the touchdown in the end zone, the summit reached, the ribbon cut. But behind every great achievement is a long process of preparation, planning, and hard work. The 1953 Everest expedition exemplifies this truth more clearly than almost any other story in the history of exploration. The summit of Everest was reached on May 29, but the achievement began months earlier, with the selection of the team, the gathering of equipment, the planning of logistics. It continued with the approach march through Nepal, the establishment of base camp, the route finding through the icefall, the carries to stock the camps, and the careful acclimatization of the climbers. Every step in this process was necessary. Every person who carried a load, who fixed a rope, who cooked a meal, who supported the effort in any way, contributed to the final success. The achievement belonged to Hillary and Tenzing, but it also belonged to Hunt and Lowe and Noyce and all the other climbers. It belonged to the Sherpas who carried heavy loads day after day. It belonged to the porters who carried supplies to base camp. It belonged to everyone who played a part, however small, in making the summit possible. This collective nature of achievement is worth remembering in our own lives. We live in a culture that often celebrates individual success and overlooks the support systems that make success possible. We praise the CEO and forget the workers, celebrate the athlete and ignore the coaches and trainers, admire the artist and overlook the teachers who taught them. But every success is built on a foundation of support, every achievement is a collective effort, even when one person stands in the spotlight. The 1953 Everest expedition teaches us this lesson. Yes, Hillary and Tenzing reached the summit and they deserved every bit of recognition they received. But they stood on the summit because Hunt planned the expedition brilliantly, because Lowe and Noyce and others established and stocked the camps, because the Sherpas carried loads that enabled the summit push, because everyone worked together toward a common goal. The expedition succeeded because it was a team effort, with each person contributing their skills and strength. As the years passed and the 1953 expedition receded into history, the achievement retained its significance. New generations discovered the story of Hillary and Tenzing, inspired by their courage and determination. The photographs of Tenzing on the summit, ice axe raised with flags flying, became iconic images, symbols of human capability and aspiration. Books and films told and retold the story, each adding new details and perspectives. Hillary himself remained remarkably modest about the achievement. In interviews throughout his life, he consistently downplayed his own role and emphasized the team effort. He spoke with respect and affection about Tenzing, about Hunt, about the other climbers and Sherpas. He acknowledged the element of luck involved, the fact that the weather had held, that no one had been seriously injured, that the equipment had functioned properly. He recognized that while skill and determination were essential, success on Everest also required factors beyond anyone's control. This humility was one of Hillary's most admirable qualities. He could have rested on his laurels, coasted on his fame, and no one would have blamed him. Instead, he devoted the rest of his life to serving others, particularly the Sherpa people who had made his achievement possible. The schools and hospitals that Hillary built in the Khumbu region are perhaps a more lasting and meaningful legacy than the summit itself. They improved lives, created opportunities, and showed genuine gratitude and respect for the Sherpa community. Tenzing, too, remained humble despite his fame. He could have been bitter about the disparity in recognition, about the fact that Hillary was knighted while he received a lesser honor, about the debates over who stepped on the summit first. Instead, he remained gracious, always speaking positively about Hillary and the expedition, always emphasizing the partnership and teamwork that made success possible. Tenzing's dignity and generosity of spirit made him a beloved figure, respected not just as a climber but as a person. The relationship between Hillary and Tenzing, forged on the slopes of Everest, endured for the rest of their lives. They met periodically, exchanged letters, and spoke warmly of each other in interviews. When Tenzing died in 1986, Hillary attended the funeral and spoke movingly about his friend and climbing partner. It was a genuine friendship, built on shared experience and mutual respect, transcending differences in culture and background. The camps on Everest, the focus of this exploration, have changed over the decades but remain in essentially the same locations. Base camp is still at the foot of the Khumbu Icefall, though it's now much larger, with hundreds of tents during the climbing season. Camps 1 through 4 are still positioned on the route that Hillary and Tenzing climbed. The South Col still hosts Camp 6, though the tents are now more sophisticated and the supplies more abundant. Modern climbers follow essentially the same route, face the same challenges, and rely on the same camp system that was pioneered in 1953. The technological improvements since 1953 have been significant but have not fundamentally changed the nature of climbing Everest. Modern climbers have better clothing, lighter equipment, more reliable oxygen systems, satellite communications, and weather forecasting. But they still face the same altitude, the same cold, the same objective dangers of avalanches and crevasses. The mountain hasn't gotten any easier, it's just that climbers have better tools to deal with its challenges. Perhaps the most important lesson from the 1953 Everest expedition is about the power of careful planning and teamwork. Hunt's meticulous organization, his systematic approach to establishing camps and stocking them with supplies, his careful management of the climbing roster to ensure everyone was properly acclimatized, all of this created the conditions for success. Combined with the skills and determination of the climbers and Sherpas, this planning turned an impossible dream into an achievable goal. This lesson applies far beyond mountaineering. Any complex endeavor, whether it's a business venture, a scientific project, an artistic creation, or a social movement, requires careful planning and teamwork. The more ambitious the goal, the more essential these elements become. You can't just set out to climb Everest, or achieve any major goal, with enthusiasm alone. You need a plan, you need the right people, you need resources properly deployed, and you need everyone working together toward the common objective. The 1953 expedition had all these elements. Hunt provided leadership and planning. Hillary and Tenzing provided the final push to the summit. The other climbers and Sherpas provided essential support throughout. Everyone understood their role and performed it to the best of their ability. And as a result, they achieved something extraordinary, something that had eluded all previous attempts, something that many had believed was impossible. As we reach the end of this story, it's worth taking a moment to reflect on what the 1953 Everest expedition means for us today, more than 70 years later. In our world of instant communication and rapid travel, it's easy to forget how isolated and challenging that expedition was. There were no satellite phones to call for rescue if something went wrong. There were no helicopters standing by to evacuate injured climbers. There was no internet to check weather forecasts or consult with experts back home. The expedition was on its own, relying on its own resources, skills, and determination. In our comfortable, connected world, we rarely face challenges that test us to our limits the way Everest tested Hillary, Tenzing, and their teammates. Most of us will never know what it's like to gasp for breath in the death zone, to face the possibility of death with every step, to push our bodies and minds to the absolute edge of their capabilities. But we can still learn from their example, we can still be inspired by their achievement, and we can still apply the lessons of teamwork, planning, and determination to our own challenges, whatever they may be. The camps on Everest, established with such effort in 1953, stood as temporary outposts in an inhospitable environment. They served their purpose and then were dismantled or abandoned, leaving little permanent trace. But what they represented, human determination, careful planning, teamwork, and the willingness to take calculated risks in pursuit of a great goal, that legacy endures. It inspires new generations of mountaineers, explorers, and adventurers. It reminds us that even the most daunting challenges can be overcome with the right approach and sufficient determination. The story of Edmund Hillary and Tenzing Norgay, of John Hunt and George Lowe, of Wilfred Noyce and Charles Evans and Tom Bourdelon, of the Sherpas who carried loads and fixed ropes and made the whole enterprise possible. This story is about more than climbing a mountain. It's about what humans can achieve when they work together. It's about leadership and courage, about planning and improvisation, about pushing limits and knowing when to turn back. It's about respect for nature and for each other, about humility in success and grace in recognition of others' contributions. These are timeless lessons, as relevant today as they were in 1953. Whether we're climbing mountains, building businesses, creating art, or simply trying to live good lives, we can learn from the example of the 1953 Everest expedition. We can plan carefully, work together, respect the challenges we face, and remain humble in our achievements. We can recognize that success is always a collective effort, that we stand on the shoulders of those who came before us and who supported us along the way. And we can remember that the summit, whatever our personal summit may be, is just one moment in a much longer journey. The real story is in the preparation, the effort, the setbacks overcome, the persistence in the face of difficulty. Hillary and Tenzing stood on the summit of Everest for just 15 minutes, but the journey to get there took months, and the impact of that achievement has lasted decades. The camps they relied on existed for just a few weeks, but the lesson of how those camps enabled success is permanent. So as you drift off to sleep tonight, perhaps you can think about your own mountains, your own challenges, your own goals. What camps do you need to establish? What supplies do you need to gather? Who are your teammates, and how can you support each other? What is your route to the summit, and how will you know when you've achieved your goal? The lessons of Everest 1953 can guide us all, not just in climbing mountains but in climbing toward whatever summits we've set for ourselves. The story of Edmund Hillary and Tenzing Norgay establishing camps on Mount Everest and reaching the summit is ultimately a story about human potential. It shows us that with careful planning, determined effort, and strong teamwork, we can achieve goals that seem impossible. It reminds us that great achievements are built on foundations of many small efforts, that summits are reached one step at a time, starting from base camps and working upward through intermediate camps until finally the goal is within reach. And it tells us that the journey is just as important as the destination, that the camps established along the way, the friendships forged, the obstacles overcome, these are the experiences that give meaning to the achievement. Hillary and Tenzing reached the summit of Everest, but they also built schools, inspired generations, showed that people from different backgrounds can work together toward common goals, and demonstrated grace and humility in their moment of greatest triumph. These lessons, these achievements, these examples, they're the real legacy of the 1953 Everest expedition. The summit was conquered on May 29, 1953, but the impact of that achievement continues to inspire and guide us. And the camps that made it possible, though long since dismantled and buried under new snow, remain as symbols of what careful preparation and determined effort can accomplish. If you've enjoyed this exploration of one of history's great mountaineering achievements, consider giving this video a like and subscribing to the channel. Share your thoughts in the comments about what the Everest story means to you, or about other great expeditions you'd like to hear about. Your support helps keep these stories alive and brings them to new audiences who can be inspired by the courage and determination of explorers who pushed the boundaries of human achievement. But for now, rest easy knowing that somewhere, high in the Himalayas, the summit of Everest still stands, still challenging, still inspiring. And somewhere, perhaps in your own life, there's a summit waiting for you, a challenge that will require your own camps, your own planning, your own determination. The lessons of Hillary and Tenzing are there to guide you, reminding you that with the right approach, even the highest summit can be reached. Sleep well, and good night.